Hi, everybody, and welcome to part one of our lecture this week, Expansion and Political Division, the Growing Sectional Conflicts of Antebellum America. This is basically the story of how the country becomes unraveled in the 3 decades before the Civil War. To see how the Republic, which had been formed by the Constitution, written in 1787, which promised a more perfect union, was in effect on the verge of self-destruction just a couple of generations later. That is, in the period that we call the antebellum period. How that same American nation, in other words, stood at the brink of a kind of self-devised Armageddon, if you will, in the form of the Civil War. So to understand this great drama, some might call it a tragedy, we have to take now a closer look, particularly at the politics of the age, to get a sense of just how this story, really epic in its scale, unfolds. And we begin with the great painting here of John Brown, the abolitionist, famous for his assault on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry and his scheme to emancipate abolitionists. Brown, depicted by the artist here, as sort of the equivalent of the great prairie tornado that you see in the background, a figure of almost Old Testament prophecy, Bible in one hand, a rifle in the other. So a great iconography, great sort of mythic imagery reminds us that this is perhaps the central story in the American storybook. Now, as I said a minute ago, the Constitution promised a more perfect union, but an early episode showed just how fragile that union really was, known as the Missouri Compromise, which took place as a political debate in Congress from 1819 to 1820, concerned the admission of new states. The country had grown considerably in the years since the Constitution was ratified. From the original 13 states, now these sort of near western territories of the Ohio and Mississippi Valley began filling in with new states through an orderly procession specified by the Constitution of adding new territories as states, as full and equal members now of the Union. But with the admission, or the proposed admission of Missouri, which you see here just in the sort of center of what was then the growing continental landscape here of Anglo settlement and political expansion, the proposed admission of Missouri set a firestorm of conflict and controversy in the National Congress, seeing the nation split ominously by section between the North and the South. There had been other political conflicts in the country, of course, up to this point, but none of them had inspired a purely geographically sectional split between North and South. Now, in the end, Missouri was in fact admitted as a state, just as Maine, here in the northeastern corner, was admitted as a state as part of a so-called compromise engineered mostly by the Kentucky Congressman Henry Clay, that would see Missouri admitted with slaveholding also protected by law in Missouri, while Maine would be admitted with slaveholding prohibited. And thus that specific compromise suggested that somehow the issue of slavery was now part of the political balancing act of this new country. But when you look at it even more closely, it seems to have been less of a compromise, really, and more of a kind of legislative parlor trick carried out by Henry Clay and his allies in Congress. Because when you, as I say, when you scrutinize the vote, a key provision in the Missouri Compromise passed by the razor-thin margin of 82 to 78. In other words, when you break the votes down by region, it seems that on the question of admission, say, of Maine as a free state, carried in the North 80 to 14 in favor, 80 to 14 in favor, but in the South, 64 to 2, 64 to 2 issued a no vote. So overall, the amendment passed, but only by 4 votes. When you add the 2 from the South with the 80 from the North and the 64 no votes in the South with the 14 no votes in the North, the total was merely 82 to 78 for the admission of Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. So not so much a compromise, but a strictly sectional vote that saw a very narrow passage. Yeah, so what sort of compromise was this really? Well, alarmed by the acrimony and sectional tenor of the debates, a really angry tone, you might say, in Congress, an aged Thomas Jefferson, still alive, still living in Monticello in Virginia, the former president and architect of American independence, Thomas Jefferson followed newspaper reports of the proceedings in Congress and grew increasingly skeptical at what he saw transpiring. He wrote in a letter to a friend, "I had for a long time ceased to read the newspapers or pay any attention to public affairs, confident they were in good hands, and content to be a passenger in our bark to the shore from which I am not distant. But this momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union. It is hushed indeed for the moment, but this is a reprieve only, not a final sentence." So there, from the architect of American independence, one of its greatest defenders, a decidedly skeptical and almost forlorn note at what he saw as the unraveling of the country between the North and the South. The aged Jefferson, who would live only for less than a half dozen more years, said, "I regret that I am now to die in the belief that the useless sacrifice of themselves by the generation of 1776 to acquire self-government and happiness to their country is to be thrown away by the unwise and unworthy passions of their sons, and that my only consolation is to be that I live not to weep over it." So Jefferson playing the prophet here, the despairing prophet, suggesting that this new sectional division over the influence of slavery, its political influence, its material influence, its potential expansion with the nation, that this divide that had opened up perhaps would spell, as he said, the death knell of the Union. That from one of the original revolutionaries of 76. Well, it certainly prompts the question, what sort of place was the South? We've looked closely in recent weeks at the institution of slavery, but let's consider the South now from a political standpoint. As one historian has put it, the South, if a democracy, was a different kind of democracy, a despot's democracy. To appreciate the meaning of this, consider that about 23% of white Southern families could claim at least one slave. But only those with 20 or more slaves were considered part of the planter class, and less than 1% owned as many as 100 or more slaves. That is, of all the Southerners then residing in the southern part of the country, that is, those we call Southerners, only 23% of white Southern families could claim slave ownership, but only less than 1% owned more than 100 slaves. That is, those we would consider the large slave-owning, plantation-owning planter class. And yet, it was this 1% that in several Southern states held the great balance of political influence, and thus a despot's democracy. A despot, it's a word you can look up. It means ruling by fiat, ruling by decree. It seems almost contradictory, in fact, to the idea of a democracy, that less than 1% of the total free population of the South would have held a great balance of power. But such was the case. The political culture of the South was built around the influence of this wealthy, politically influential planter class, who formed a kind of fraternity, really, of wealthy, educated, slave-owning, landed elites. You see the pictures of some of them sketched on the cover of Harper's Weekly magazine in the antebellum period. The men who ruled not only their slaveholding fiefdoms, but ruled much of the Southern political establishment as well. The people expect that their leader, in whose public spirit they have confidence, will think for them, and that they will be prepared to act as their leaders think, said a Southern newspaper at the time, basically acknowledging the expectation that these men, these great slave-owning planters, would run the politics of their region. There was very little campaigning in the South. There was no effective two-party system. Few bothered to announce platforms ahead of time, that is, the issues which they would support. And it was typically the case that once nominated, the candidate for office was rarely opposed, that is, often ran unopposed in the political system. So no need for campaigning, no competitive two-party system, few bothering to announce the issues for which they stood, and nominees rarely challenged. This was the planter, the despot's planterocracy, as some critics called it, a kind of subversion, really, of a democratic system in which the wealthiest and most powerful of the slave-owning class essentially ruled as a kind of privileged elite. During South Carolina's so-called nullification crisis in 1832, planter politicians had threatened disunion at that time over the passing of a new tariff, a tariff which they perceived to be against the basic interests of the slaveholding South. Thomas Cooper, one of the leaders of the South Carolina delegation, said, "We have to calculate the value of the Union and ask of what use to us is this most unequal alliance." And you see here a cartoon from the period showing members of South Carolina's planter elite, including John C. Calhoun here in the center, the former Secretary of War and high-profile political figure in the antebellum era. John C. Calhoun is shown ascending a pyramid of disunion in order to grab the crown of despotism. Well, this from a critic's perspective, of course, but there's no denying the fact that the South Carolinians during the nullification crisis of 1832, an episode that is often forgotten, that concerned itself with the seemingly mundane issue of a tariff, that nevertheless, that disunion, that is, threats to disband the Union, to take South Carolina of its own accord out of the United States, seemed to prefigure and foreshadow the larger constitutional crisis that would engulf the country at the time of the Civil War. This is 30 years now in advance of the Civil War that a southern state was threatening disunion. From 1836 to 1844, leaders in Congress maintained a so-called gag rule that prevented open debate of issues related to slavery. It turns out that even the tariff issue of 1832 had connections to the interests of a slave-owning class that had come to see itself as predominant in the affairs of the South. So much so that it was able to enforce a gag rule, that is, a standing order that all issues related to their slaveholding interests, that is, all debates over slavery itself, could be prevented from taking place in the Congress, despite the honored tradition of open debate in the National Congress. The gag rule itself, introduced first and repeated every session, typically read that all petitions, memorials, and papers touching the abolition of slavery, or the buying, selling, or transferring of slaves in any state, district, or territory of the United States, be laid on the table without being debated, printed, read, or referred, and that no further action whatever shall be had thereon. This idea of laying on the table a request to introduce a bill or to debate a particular provision of a bill or to read a resolution sent by constituents, this absolute refusal to give them any airing, any reading, any actual debate meant that for a time not only was free speech essentially censored in the House, but that any discussion of the issue of slavery itself was as well. And here you see yet another cartoon with its caption, "Abolition Frowned Down," showing not only anxious slaves peeking over a cotton bale, but a Southern defender of abolitionism seemingly defeated, with his head resting on the ground over the tattered remnants of petitions that constituents had asked be introduced into Congress. Keep in mind that the right to petition Congress is one of the key constitutional rights in the Bill of Rights listed, the right to petition an assembly. And yet it was this very right, this right of petitioning, that was effectively now drowned out by the leaders of the Southern delegation, the slave-owning leaders of the Southern delegation. Interestingly enough, the result of this gag rule was an avalanche of petitions sent by anti-slavery societies that kept the issue of North-South sectional politics alive in Congress despite the gag rule. Borrowing from the Quaker tradition of collecting petition prayers, the American Anti-Slavery Society organizes an abolitionist petition effort on a large scale in the 1830s and 40s, as if to keep the issue alive by forcing the proponents and supporters and defenders of the gag rule, keep them busy, keep them actively squelching and censoring debate, because every time one of these petitions made its way to Congress, and really it was nothing more than a kind of mass-produced petition heading here that could be appended to a blank sheet of paper where local people might sign their names in support. This was a mass circulation effort, a mass mailing effort by abolitionist leaders to keep the issue alive in Congress. Typically, these petitions would read of some abolitionist objective: respectfully pray that the proper steps may be made for the repeal of all laws and the alteration of all constitutional provisions by which the people of the free states, the federal government, or the nation are in any way implicated or bound to countenances, protect, or in any manner aid in supporting or continuing the institution of slavery, or in keeping human beings in a state of slavery. So an abolitionist call for the North to separate itself from all slaveholding interests, not just slavery itself, which had been banned in most northern states, but even the economic connections to the southern states and the interests of slavery, or in any way supporting laws that required, for example, northerners to be on the lookout for fugitive slaves and the return of fugitive slaves. Something that the Constitution, again, itself enshrined, was now being denounced in the petitions of northern abolitionists. Petitions, of course, that the slave owners wanted desperately to keep hidden and censored, but which the sheer weight and volume of petitions sent to Congress made almost impossible. It was said that so many petitions stacked up in the halls of the Congress that one could hardly move from one office to the next without tripping over or stepping around a stack of unopened petitions. Capable of mobilizing supporters in big cities and small towns alike, men as well as women, and signed by abolitionists and those northerners who resented the arrogant restriction of open debate in Congress, these petitions became a symbol of the growing division between North and South. This particular petition you see here called for the dissolution of the union now existing between the northern and southern states in order to separate the North from slavery. Think of that. Just as the South and South Carolina in particular had called for disunion over the tariff issue of 1832, so too now were some northern abolitionists calling for disunion over the issue of slavery. This particular petition was signed by both men and women, a practice that critics labeled promiscuous because women were not formally recognized by law as being politically enfranchised, and thus their behavior seemed somehow unseemly. Nevertheless, these women joined with their men to express their political views, not as voters, but as petition signers, identifying themselves by name almost 75 years before having the right to vote. Controversial stuff. All of this stoking northern fears, that is the gag rule, stoking northern fears over a slave power conspiracy that sought to subordinate national and northern interests to the interests of King Cotton. Theodore Parker, a northern abolitionist, put it this way: ever since the adoption of the Constitution, protected by that shield, mastering the energies of the nation and fighting with that weapon, slavery has been continually aggressive. The slave driver has coveted new soil, has claimed it, has had his claim allowed. Louisiana, Florida, Texas, California, and New Mexico are the results of Southern aggression. Now the slave driver reaches out his hands towards Cuba, trying to clutch that emerald gem set in the tropic sea. So here Theodore Parker tell it, the South was motivated by a slave power conspiracy, that is, a cabal of privileged and powerful slave owners who would stop at nothing to acquire new territories, to see slavery expanded, and their own political interests somehow reinforced. Well, tempted as we might be to chalk this up to conspiratorial thinking and paranoia on the part of northern abolitionists, all bets were off, it seemed, when Southern congressional leaders called for the annexation of Texas to the United States in 1844. Texas, a northern state of Mexico, had been settled by slave-owning Anglo-Americans who proclaimed it an independent republic in 1836. The proposed annexation immediately inspired a political division along sectional lines and broke wide open the gag rule once and for all. This cartoon shows Southern supporters of annexation now depicted as crazy fanatics, while Northern opponents continued to sign petitions. No annexation of Texas, read this particular petition. Yes, Texas, a northern state of Mexico, had been settled by slave-owning Anglo-Americans who proclaimed it an independent republic in 1836 and had fought for the independence of the state from Mexico. The famous siege at the Alamo became a rallying cry for Anglo-Texans to support the independence of their territory. Here is what that famous church, that citadel of Anglo-Texan independence, looks like today in its historic preservation. In fact, you can check out the trailers below, two different versions of the Alamo, one from 1960 and one more recently from 2004. So if you have some time to get on YouTube, you can see just how the interpretation of the Alamo itself has changed over time. But taking a look at the map here for a second, consider that the original territory claimed by Anglo-Texans was this territory here. That originally was Texas as far as the Anglo slaveholding colonizers were concerned. But when the United States got around to calling for an annexation of Texas, Southern politicians successfully lobbied to have a much larger area of territory claimed now as legitimately belonging to the Anglo-Texans, thus giving rise again into the North of claims and cries of conspiracy by a slaveholding elite that was gobbling up territory from a sovereign neighbor, Mexico, without real justification, ultimately sending the United States on a path of war. Because the ultimate annexation of Texas, with those larger borders included, resulted in exactly that, a war with Mexico, which, even though the U.S. proved victorious in, inspired ever deeper political divisions between the slaveholding and non-slaveholding states. It was a young congressman, in fact, from Illinois, serving his one term in Congress in 1847, who introduced a resolution criticizing the president at the time and those Southerners who supported the annexation of Texas. Whereas the President of the United States, in his message of May 11th, 1846, has declared that the Mexican government not only refused to receive him, that is the envoy of the United States, or listen to his propositions, but after a long continued series of menaces has at last invaded our territory and shed the blood of our fellow citizens on our soil. And whereas this House of Representatives is desirous to obtain a full knowledge of all the facts which go to establish whether that particular spot on which the blood of our citizens was shed was or was not at that time our own soil. These were the words of Congressman Abraham Lincoln of Illinois, who in effect was calling out the President, calling out the Congress to prove that its claims were true, that the claim of President Polk, for example, that the United States had been unlawfully invaded by the country of Mexico. The young Congressman Lincoln demanded to know the spot on American soil that Mexico had invaded, because what Lincoln knew and what many Northerners understood was that the claims of the President, a Southerner and a slaveholder himself, and his Southern supporters in Congress, that their claim that America had been invaded by Mexico was built on the false notion that territory never granted to Texas, but now claimed by Southerners, had been the soil of contention, if you will. Whatever the case, it seems that the American victory in the war with Mexico and the subsequent Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo added to the existing nation now an additional huge swath of territory, a huge swath of territory ceded to the United States by treaty that would effectively ensure the continued debate over slavery's future, and that debate furthermore would become all the more intense. You see not only Texas here with the expanded boundaries, but also the Utah, Nevada territory, along with California. Keep in mind that it's the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which resulted from America's victory over Mexico in the Mexican War, a war that was occasioned by spurious claims now of territorial invasion, that this territory was now part of the United States. It was a congressman from Pennsylvania who objected to these terms, a congressman by the name of David Wilmot, who introduced his own resolution in 1846, provided that as an express and fundamental condition to the acquisition of any territory from the Republic of Mexico by the United States, by virtue of any treaty which may be negotiated between them, and to the use by the executive of the moneys herein appropriated, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of said territory, except for crime whereof the party shall first duly be convicted. So read the famous Wilmot Proviso, introduced by Congressman David Wilmot of Pennsylvania in 1846. In effect, what Wilmot was calling for was that any land ceded by Mexico or won as a result of the Mexican War, that such territory be free of slavery. This set off a firestorm of debate once again in Congress. Ultimately, the Wilmot Proviso, in fact, was defeated, and the question of slavery remained an open question. Okay, so that's it for now. We will look at part 2 of this intensifying drama of expansion and political division next time.